Oh yay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the stage, please. Oh, bib. Oh, fair enough. Thank you.
You wanted me to talk about? I seem to remember that it was Ukraine and the issues associated with that. The main thing is, last week I said that I doubted that Russia would invade.
You did.
Mainly because I thought they can pressure and gain influence within the area they were interested in.
Okay.
And then I started looking into it a bit more because I haven't really looked at Ukraine for quite a long time. And it suddenly emerged out of nowhere. We had the COVID story going on. And as soon as COVID went down, Ukraine went up. So I thought it was most of the West blustering around things. But actually it turned out that there's a big restructuring of global power relations taking place, in which the Russians are simply asserting their power, as was actually, thinking about it, likely to be the case. They had the ability to take over Ukraine, or better said, they've got the ability to take over Ukraine. Militarily, they have the power to do so, and the West is in a weak position because after Biden withdrew from Afghanistan, the Americans are hardly in a position to go to war anywhere, and despite their talk since 2008 about Ukraine joining NATO, there was actually no possibility of Ukraine joining NATO. So really Zelensky and the Ukrainians have been led up the garden path by the Americans and by Europe, by NATO and by Europe, in trying to pretend to them that is somehow about to enter into the Western European sphere of influence or into NATO's sphere of influence. And so this calculation that some people in Ukraine made, largely because of the events of 2000, the events when the Kremlin took Crimea and pro-Kremlin activists took over in the east of Ukraine. But before that, Ukraine was swinging between a sort of independent position and a position aligned with Moscow. The truth of the matter is, most of the Ukrainian economy is integrated in one way or another with the Russian economy. And so there's not really a way out for the Ukraine out of those circumstances. And it was a mistake for anybody to believe that the Russians would tolerate a NATO power right next to Moscow and just south of Moscow and in the heartland of Russia. And so the idea that the Russians would tolerate that long term is false. And the invasion as it is so far, well, they've made rapid advances to certain positions with apparently very few people killed. Of course, there were people killed between 2014 and now in eastern Ukraine and the battles going on there. But in Kiev and places like this, very few people have died so far. And I thought to myself, well, if the Russians were to seize control, as they're implying in the news, on the BBC, the Financial Times, the Guardian, the rest of them, and by the way, the censorship imposed around coronavirus is now being applied to the issue of Ukraine. So if you post certain things on Ukraine, Meta have declared they will censor, so Facebook is censoring, and others are also censoring. And the artificial intelligence algorithms, dominated now by the military, whereas previously it was supposedly by the health department, although it's difficult to tell which is which nowadays. Because don't forget, Public Health England was officially renamed a few months ago, towards the end of the pandemic as they call it, was renamed as Public Security, Health Security Agency. And all the regulations around movement and restrictions on people moving based on coronavirus passes, vaccine passes, all this sort of stuff, is also sort of borderland questions. Who can move where? What a nation is also defined by who can move where. And one of the most clear signs that the West was going to throw its weight, supposedly, behind Ukraine was a decision published on the website of Public Health Security England on the 18th of this month, 4 days before the Russians went into Ukraine, saying that anyone from Ukraine can come to England without taking a COVID test. Now, only people from the Falklands or Ireland or Scotland could do that otherwise. And so I asked myself, well, what's this about then? A bit odd. The only people allowed into Britain are people from Ukraine. Now, the Ukrainians, of course, it should be said, first of all, are the people suffering most in this crisis. And this crisis, however, was orchestrated by the idiocy of American policy. Because American policy was, in 2008, to tell the Ukrainians they could join NATO when they knew they'd never be allowed in. And the second thing was they orchestrated a coup d'etat on the 22nd of February 2014, known as the Maidan. And what happened there was that some kind of special operation, either orchestrated by the Americans or behind the scenes, like puppets organizing it, some special forces were on top of some of the buildings and shooting at people on Maidan Square, where there had been protests for quite a long time.
Using British sniper rifles.
But what was interesting was that both sides were shot at. And that was used as an excuse to then carry out a de facto coup d'etat, where the president of the country, who was torn, as most of the Ukrainian presidents, torn between the economic pull of Russia, which dominates the realities of Ukraine, and the enticements that they might join the European Union or they might join NATO. And actually, I think it was Secretary of State, Ambassador Newland at the time, she said about the Europeans, because the Europeans were trying to make a deal. The Germans, in other words, were intervening in Ukraine themselves independently, but largely for economic and diplomatic reasons. Meanwhile, the Americans had geostrategic and military reasons for intervening. And so they wanted the Germans, those people who were influenced by the Germans, to be ousted by the new government. And so Newland then turned around, as she said, on a recorded telephone discussion. She said, well, you know what? Fuck the Europeans. That's what she was quoted. You heard the audio recordings in 2014. So there is a triple battle going on here. The Ukrainians were trying to make alliances with Europe, and the Europeans with Ukraine. But Europeans are also tied in with Russia. So they wanted a connection in that way. Ukraine, sympathetic to Europe, but under the tutelage of Russia, because we want the gas from Russia. Germany's former Chancellor is the head of Gazprom. They're in charge of Nord Stream 2. And Nord Stream 2 was intended to bypass the Ukraine. The Ukrainians make a lot of money out of the transit between Russia and through Ukraine. They make a lot of money out of subsidized gas which they receive from Russia. So always there's been this wobbling. You know, there was a woman, Tymoshenko, I believe her name was, the one who had her hair beaded round like this after the Orange Revolution, which is an orchestrated revolution carried out by the Americans. Sort of, you know, Extinction Rebellion gone mad, you know, that type of thing. You have flags, you have colours, they name one colour, they have a flag with a symbol or a coloured flag, and then they demand certain things which are popular. Ukrainian governments have been run by oligarchs and thieves who stole the resources of Ukraine from the people after they got independence. And that was generally the case, you know, not only in Ukraine, but in Russia as well. And in Kazakhstan, in Tajikistan, in all the former republics of the Soviet Union, gangsters gained control of the economic resources of the country and plundered the people. They suffered. And Ukraine suffered more than any of those countries, actually. They had the worst living standards in Western Ukraine, even worse than in the East. Now, the consequence of that is this is why you're seeing. You'd think that if a country was invaded, the people would en masse resist. You'd think that would be the case. But actually, the resistance, you look, most people are just running away. They don't want to be part of it. One, because they think, okay, the Russians could cause a huge destruction if they wanted to. but also because the morale is not there. The morale is not there because their country has been run by a kitchen of thieves.
You've not been there.
Sorry?
You've not been there.
I haven't been there. You're right. You're right. Well, you give your point of view. You're welcome to give your point of view. I'm not going to stop you. You're welcome to give your point of view. But what I'm saying is my observation of what is going on.
They're making you think that's wrong because their morale is low.
Where did I say wrong? Did I say wrong? Did I say wrong? You cycled up a few seconds. You cycled up a couple of seconds ago. I was in mid-sentence, you caught one word and started attacking me. You don't have a clue what I'm arguing. So why don't you first of all...
Because it pisses me off.
What pisses you off? That I'm arguing anything? You're saying that I'm speaking about anything? Right, I haven't been there. Now do you want... Hang on. Do you want Britain to arm Ukraine?
It's too late for that.
Do you? No, but the British government is saying, we'll send weapons. Do you support that? Do you support that? Do you support Britain sending weapons?
No, I support that one as well.
Sending troops. So you see, here's a man who accuses me of knowing nothing because I haven't been there. And now he says, I must go there and fight, even though I know nothing because I haven't been there. So, you see, it's useful, even if something triggers in your ear. When you hear someone speak, it's useful to first figure out what they're arguing before you attack them.
And Putin, he got involved in it, and he take our will. Putin, he involved in Sudan, because we made revolution for 30 years, and he bring the army and support him, and they give him gun, and he said, the Marines...
Are we interested in Ukraine
go back to Sudan
because we support democracy?
Yes,
Are we?
No.
We haven't had democracy in Britain for 2 years.
They need their will.
We've been locked down on and off around the world, by the way, for the last 2 years.
Why talk about coronavirus?
Because the one thing followed directly from the other. They are integrated together. If you imagine that the lies told over the last 2 years are now suddenly replaced with truth because we're at war or there is a war in Ukraine, I think you've got another thing coming. Lies, first of all, everybody knows the first victim of war is truth. Everybody knows that. Even the Financial Times today had an article where they said 50% of the stories we are now being told are almost certainly false. So the question is, which 50%? Assuming 50%, of course. Assuming 50% are true. What's that?
You was talking about coronavirus.
Yes.
Plus, you said the Spanish flu was dangerous than the corona. You believe it, everybody believe it.
Long time ago, but that's slightly different subject matter for now.
They have their own right to keep away from Putin. I don't want to be Russian. I'm Ukrainian, and I want to own my own country. I want to be whatever I want to be.
It is perfectly fine and perfectly correct that the Ukrainians naturally feel that this is a barbaric imposition against them. It's perfectly correct and natural that or most Ukrainians who are pro-Russian will think that. Of course they are. What do you expect? Of course they would. However,
Of course they would. They're brainwashed by Russia.
Sorry?
They are brainwashed by Russia.
Well, there are people who are pro-Russian. There are other people who are not pro-Russian. There's lots of people, for example, in Kiev who speak Russian mainly.
Yes,
even if they're anti-Russian.
Fighting against Russia right now, as we can see in plenty
Some
of
of them are, some of them are. But the question is then,
majority
is it in the interest, what is the purpose, better said, of the Russian invasion?
What is the purpose?
It's to defeat the Americans.
The purpose is to
The
send a
victims
message
of
that they
this,
can do whatever they want
Yes.
because Biden is weak.
vis-a-vis America. Because the American intervention is the cause of the problem. The American support for the idea of NATO membership for Ukraine.
Excuse me, have you ever heard of such a thing as the Budapest Memorandum,
Yes.
where the US
2000,
and the
2008,
UK have promised protection to Ukraine from Russian incursions? Have the US and have the UK come
No, they're not going
honor
to.
their promise?
They led Zelensky
They haven't.
and
They
led
haven't.
the
Spoiler
Ukrainian
alert,
people
they haven't.
up the garden path. They led them up the garden path. They made
The
out
garden
we'll
path,
defend
huh?
you, we'll help you, we're your allies, we're your
Okay,
friends.
sorry, so what are you
buy
complaining
this, buy
about?
that, make a deal.
What are you complaining
I'm not
about
complaining,
then?
I'm describing. I'm
No, you
describing
are
what's
complaining. You're saying that the US has intervened in Ukraine when the US hasn't done nearly enough to
So you're
intervene
saying,
in Ukraine
I mean,
and
the
defend
first
Ukraine
people
from
who
this
the British
incursion.
got out of Ukraine were military trainers the British have been using to train Ukrainian soldiers.
Good.
They were the first 150 they took out.
They should have trained them.
As a Ukrainian, it's natural you're going to say that.
Of course I'm going to
Naturally
say that
you're gonna
because
say
this
that.
is an incursion
However,
into an independent
what I'm
country.
saying is, the idea that they spread into the ideas of Zelensky and into the brains of many people in Ukraine was that they were going to be welcomed in and Britain or America would do something for them. Britain and America are not going to do anything for them. They're not even going to cut off the swift transmissions of Gazprom, right? They're not even going to do that. They will make a deal. Probably this will be at the expense of Zelensky. They'll make a deal with the Russians, probably in the next few days. I think that's what will happen. But war is difficult, so you can't be right about everything. I think they'll make a deal before Russia goes into Kiev, because Russia knows they will lose a lot of people if they go into Kiev. It will be a bloody battle. And so, rather than do that, they sit on the outskirts. They show they can do. They compel those people in Ukraine who are thinking, well, we need to escape from this problem. And we have to accept the Yanks are never going to do anything. The Brits are never going to do anything. All these cry, send weapons, send manpower like the guy just now. It's not going to happen.
What do you mean?
Everybody
They've
knows
already
it's not
sent
going to
weapons.
happen.
You just said that the British have trained some Ukrainian military
yes,
in Ukraine.
yes, yes.
They have been sending weapons to Ukraine, and the sanctions have been getting more and more strict by the day. Now look, Heiko, it's fun. Hold on. I'm about to agree with you. I am about to agree with you because this is something I actually agree with you about. I think, yeah, thank you. Finally, some silence from that individual. This is something I actually agree with you about. I think they haven't done nearly enough, and I don't think they will do nearly enough for this. But Russia is also running on fumes. They were never expecting to ever face such resistance in Ukraine, and at last there is no more traitors in the Ukrainian command and control system in terms of its military, which is what caused the previous invasion in
I think you'll
2014.
find whatever agreement is made between Zelensky and the Russians,
There's not going to be any agreements.
I think you'll find there will be. They'll make some kind of agreement, and that agreement will involve basically purging the pro-American layer out of the leadership of the army and out of the leadership of government. Don't forget the way, what was her name again? Timoshenko, is that right?
Timoshenko, she's not in charge.
No, but when she was in charge, she came to power on the back of American support for the Orange Revolution, but afterwards, she began to make all these deals with the Russians. Poroshenko, Yanukovych.
Poroshenko.
No. I said earlier. First, Timoshenko. Poroshenko later on, when he was elected president. Yanukovych also making deals with the Americans. They jump between one side and the other, but they're pulled behind Russia because of the realities of economic life.
I'm sorry. Now you're just talking about things you don't know about. So let's start with Yanukovych, which is one of the people that you mentioned right now. Yanukovych was in the beginning very pro-Russia when he was trying to become a president. But he knew that the vast majority of Ukrainians don't want to be in closer relations with Russia. Instead, they want closer relations with the EU. Most of Ukrainians wanted to join the EU. And he made promises to the Ukrainian people that he would make moves towards making closer relations with the EU and eventually perhaps making Ukraine join the EU. But he came back on those promises immediately after he was elected because he was one of Putin's puppets in Eastern Europe from day one.
So in other words, he led them up the garden path. It's again what I'm saying. There was no possibility of Ukraine joining the European Union.
Not with him, because he was a Russian puppet.
Not with any of them. The European Union was never going to step on the toes of Russia to that extent where the Russians would cut off the gas and so on, which is what, of course, has happened for the time being. But of course, or better said, the West has cut off the gas. But ultimately, the West said the Germans would scream and shout when energy prices rise by 50 or 100% in a few months. And so the idea that the Germans would be determined and stand their ground is nonsense. And they were never going to accept Ukraine into the European Union. So they should never have lied, told these lies and falsehoods to the Ukrainian people.
Now, once again, I agree with you that
they
the
have it
Germans
now in
have
the
been
news.
very
You missed the
two-faced.
news now.
And not only the Germans, a lot of the Western European countries are very much defended.
You are here, there was in the news.
To understand the
Apparently
dynamics.
just this morning Russia was cut off from SWIFT.
From what? From SWIFT. Well, from SWIFT, except Gazprom dealings and Gazprom banking. So, in other words, not cut
It's
off.
done through SWIFT.
Now,
What are you talking
part of that may also be, although they're going about SWIFT and everyone's supposed to know about
this is
SWIFT rapid transactions, don't forget there is also in the background to the SWIFT discussion, there is the entire discussion about blockchain versus existing banking transmissions. And that idea may well be being used as a cover, an excuse to try and introduce some kind of blockchain mechanisms around the world. So I don't know if that's the case, but I suspect that may be part of the reasoning behind this case. Do not believe, the first thing to understand when a war like this breaks out, do not believe what they are telling you. It's the starting point to understand what is happening. Because war is generally the mechanism for lying, propaganda, extortion and manipulation of the population. And as I said, the Boris Johnson story came. First there was chaos. Boris Johnson's in trouble. Then COVID declines. Suddenly COVID is over. I got on the tube yesterday with my friends in there. Packed to the rafters. Packed to the rafters. You could barely stand on the tube right next to another person. I thought we were all killers who might kill each other if we don't have a mask on. Now we're packed in the tube like sardines, more packed than before 2020. And so that's how much they're concerned about COVID. Suddenly, COVID has gone and war has come. Now, obviously, Russia took the initiative. You're perfectly correct.
Just to remember, behind the wall, they're always the purpose of controlling the oil and the gas. Always. And the purpose, that's why the Gazprom and the second pipeline they're trying to do, that's the way they want to control it.
There is the famous quote from George Orwell. I'll paraphrase, because I can't remember exactly. But he says, the war is not intended to be won. It's meant to be continuous. We're not at war with East Asia or Eurasia. The point is to continue the war and maintain the people in submission. So the key question is, what is happening at home in our country? They tell us to focus on Ukraine. Meanwhile, the prices in Britain are rising. The living standards, the real living standards, are falling. The conditions we've been living in semi-incarceration for 2 years, with our freedoms and rights taken away. The right to gather in Speaker's Corner taken away.
To help Ukraine, same with the US.
What's that?
There have been treaties signed between the UK and Ukraine
But they're
that
not
would make the
worth
UK
the paper
act
they're written
in this
on.
situation.
Sorry?
They're not part of what? Sorry?
They're not worth the paper they're written on.
They're not worth the paper.
Because power's decided by guns, as we know. That's what's
There
happening.
we go. So hold on. You think we should throw away all the treaties we made before just because they're worthless?
Well, it depends on the circumstances. Some treaties
I mean,
are totally
you're claiming
worthless,
they're
yes.
worthless.
Now,
For Russia, this treaty has been indeed worthless. They didn't honor the agreement. They didn't honor the Budapest Memorandum. They invaded every single country that they pledged not to invade. Belarus, Kazakhstan, and now Ukraine.
Georgia.
No, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and now Ukraine. These are the countries of the Budapest Memorandum. Georgia was never part of the Budapest Memorandum.
Okay, you said they invaded them.
They invaded them, yes.
Invaded Belarus.
They invaded Belarus, yes.
When?
Because the Belarusian leader, Lukashenko, asked them to invade.
That's not an invasion.
No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
They invaded Georgia.
They quashed
But when
a
they took
rebellion.
Georgia,
They quashed a
someone pointed this out
rebellion
to me the
of
other
the
day.
Belarusian people against their dictator.
When they went into Georgia, they went up to the Tbilisi and so on, and then withdrew. So they went in, showed they had the might to do something, and then compelled discussion. And that's what I think now is the most likely result. I don't think a generalised assault and war is going to happen in Kiev, because it would be a bloody affair. And yes, Putin's position is not 100%
I mean,
stable.
is that why he's getting nuclear weapons ready?
nuclear weapons have always been there. Nothing new
I've
about
always
that.
been there. Okay,
Nothing new
that's
about
why
that
he made a
whatsoever.
speech
Nothing.
just today,
Yes,
an hour
I know.
ago,
I know.
about preparing nuclear
No,
weapons.
everyone knows there's not going to be a nuclear war.
There we go. Everybody knew nobody was going to invade Ukraine. He invaded anyway.
With Britain or anyone else with nuclear weapons. Putin threatens Britain with nuclear weapons.
That's why he's got nuclear weapons.
What are you gonna do about it?
Nuclear? What do you mean? What are we going to do about it? We've had these nuclear weapons since
Did you
1949.
know that Ukraine also had nuclear weapons? But
Yeah,
in
yeah.
1997
Got rid of them,
we
yeah.
gave it up.
Yeah.
And US, Britain, France and Russia signed an agreement that
Yeah.
they will support Ukraine and defend them.
Well, they didn't say they're going to nuke them,
It
and they
says
certainly
specifically
weren't
about
going to defend them.
nukes.
They certainly were never going to
So
defend
coming
them.
back to my first question, Putin threatens your life. What are you gonna do about it?
How does Putin? What do you mean Putin threatens my life? Putin
said-
threatens the life of you in Ukraine. You mean?
No, I mean you exactly. He threatens
You.
He threatens everyone,
Well, they've all. I mean, the Russians.
the whole world.
The Russians in the Soviet Union, better said,
You
the
can't
world
just
was
say-
supposedly on the brink of nuclear war. I remember the television news at that time. It wasn't coronavirus, how many people, how many cases. It wasn't climate change, how much temperature rise. It was, are we 1 minute to midnight of nuclear war? And every couple of months, one event happened in one country or another country, and we were supposed to cower in our seats, jump under a table, and prepare for nuclear war, which never came and was never going to come. Never came and was never going to come. However, in those countries, which were considered to be buffer states of the Soviet Union, there could be war, as there was in Hungary, as there was a military intervention in East Germany, in the Warsaw Pact countries. They would intervene if they thought they were threatened, and the West knew it and agreed to it. And the Soviets also tolerated military actions by Western powers all around the world, including coup d'etats, all around the world as part of a deal. The big powers play big power politics. That's what's happening today. Unfortunately for the Americans, they're losing. Just the same as they lost in Afghanistan, they're losing. But yes, the victims in all this, from both sides, are the Ukrainians. I don't deny that. But what am I supposed to say? Am I supposed to pretend to you that Britain is going to come to your aid? Or that Britain is an ally? That the British people are somehow going to defend democracy in Ukraine? They're not. Or so-called democracy in Ukraine. Kleptocracy you've got in Ukraine, as you have in Russia, as you have here, by the way. As you have here. Where do you think the Russian and Ukrainian gangsters hide their money?
Here.
In London, right? There was just a recent case, I think it was the Agricultural Bank or something like that. Hundreds of millions plundered by Ukrainian gangsters, right? And in a country where, what's the living standard? $300 a month? $400 a month people earn? So the people are barely existing. And yet they say, oh, you're going to join the European Union. Well, they're not going to join the European Union. They're not going to be welcomed in. And they're part of a power play between the big powers. And of course, some people are saying, well, it's a big mistake on the part of the Americans, and the Americans should pivot to Asia and leave the Europeans. And that, of course, is part of the game of the Americans now, is to extricate themselves by this, by pushing the Europeans into a conflict with Russia. That's the idea they'd like. Sorry?
You're just gonna ignore the threat.
Well, it's not ignore the threat, it's discuss what
That's the way
is.
it's going.
It's discuss what is. Not pretend, live in some fairyland, some cuckoo land, where we imagine there's some sort of, oh, democracy exists in the West. For a start, democracy did not exist for the last 2 years.
You're gonna see consequences that you've never imagined. That's what he said.
Which are what?
And Britain is an ally with Ukraine, and it's helping it economically.
So the fact of the matter is, the alliance with Ukraine is absolutely zero. There's no reality behind this so-called alliance. The facade they put on is all about home politics.
And yet
Boris Johnson was on his knees 3 weeks ago.
Yes.
How does he revive himself? He's an international military pop star. He's Winston Churchill. He's Napoleon.
That's what I'm rooting for.
That's all it's about.
That's what we're
It's got
rooting for.
nothing to do
And the
with
clever
any
people.
defense of the Ukrainian people or any military action in Ukraine. It's got nothing to do with that. It's a on the same. Macron wants to make the deal with the Russians and Ukrainians. He wants to be the intermediary. Why? Because he's in trouble. There's an election coming up in France and he can lose the election. Biden wants to pretend that he can do something because the Americans were so destroyed in Afghanistan.
Talk of the devil.
Talk of the devil. Oh no, that's Mr. Corbyn. I'll take him in a minute. So the Americans, you see, there is also an interesting play here. Which forces are involved in the military? The military, don't forget, is a large industrial complex funded by government and involved in science and technology and in communications, the latest technologies, and they have an army of private companies funded by state finance. What used to be called in America the military industrial complex, primarily based around California. Now this military industrial complex is tied in with big industry and with oil and gas, which of course was the decisive question for war in much of the 20th century, particularly the last 40, 50 years. Most of the wars have been connected in one way or another with oil and gas and control over it, and control over countries with oil and gas. With coronavirus, the governments around the world, in particular the Western governments, were spending vast amounts of money, public money, on technology and pharmaceuticals and testing programs in order to create mechanisms of control over the population and to practice those mechanisms of control over a period of 2 years. Lockdown, masks, distancing, jabs, pharmaceuticals, treatments, hospital organisation, planning, behavioural insights, all that type of stuff that was the game of the last couple of years. And now we have a similar entity, the military-industrial complex, but with a different social base. The military-industrial complex is associated more closely with the Republicans and the Trump department, and less so with the Democrats. Not completely separate, but less so with the Democrats. Now these people have made a play for power. That play for power involves jacking up, pumping up fear and threats. Fear and threats guarantee the government pumps the money their way. Instead of to climate change, well, we've got a war on our hands. Instead of COVID, well, COVID's gone down, there's a war on our hands. And so these are about smoke and mirror games played by the ruling elite, what they call the fog of war, to throw dust in the eyes of the people. You are the people the war is against. Not the Ukrainians, not the Russians. You are the people. Yes, in Russia, the war is against the Russians. In Ukraine, the war is against the Ukrainians. But here, it's a war against us that is being fought in the name of stoking up fear against Russia. Fear against Russia in reality will add up to nothing. However, the Americans and the British would like to prepare for conflict with China. And there is no buffer in China. There's Hong Kong, former British colony, British influence, calling for independence. Will the Chinese just take over and snuff it all out? Will Britain intervene? Will they? Xinjiang. In Xinjiang, they've been stoking up as well. They're concentration camps, gulags. We must protect the Xinjiang people. Are we really going to protect the Xinjiang people? Or so-called protect the Xinjiang people? Not a word of it. But of course, they'll stoke up the fear and anger and mood within the population because China is an enemy of the West. It has a different socio-economic system. A different economy, different public ownership dominates in China. Private ownership subordinate. The Communist Party. There is a real Cold War with China. With Russia, it's a bit different. Russia, the Soviet regime was overthrown. The regime in power in Russia is Putin and oligarchs, private sector oligarchs, who stole and plundered the wealth of Russia from the people of Russia, who need to reinforce their power and authority by mechanisms of showing a bit of strength. And of course that's what's going on. They thought the Americans should have known this. But they didn't care. The Ukrainians are dispendable cannon fodder in their global games. to stoke up the support, more important than whatever happens in Ukraine, as far as the American government's concerned, as far as the American capitalist class is concerned, is the accumulation of capital from the state transferred instead of to COVID, but to the military. And then the military stocks and shares go skyrocketing. And all that is connects in with the battle against China. Because in China, the battle is about artificial intelligence and the fourth industrial revolution. All the catchwords of the World Economic Forum, of the Great Reset Brigade, all that tendency within capital who want to push the world towards a new dystopian technological dictatorship over the population, where they know everything about you, wherever you are at any time, and they don't require a hardware military intervention. They just send drones into the air, target the individual person, blow them up, or control what they're doing. Some people like Elon Musk have even got these mad ideas, putting the chips in the brains, 1,000 probes in your brain, and control the human brain. Human brain machine interface. Sorry?
I saw him say that when they put the chip in your brain, he says,
well, they put it in the monkeys and all the monkeys died.
But he said it'll do the heavy thinking for you.
Right, the heavy thinking. That's right. That's what they say. And of course, they've made a big play for the control over the future of technology, which is really what this game is about. It's about who gets the money for the technology. The government of America needs to pump money into the military, artificial intelligence, and fourth industrial revolution technology, dual purpose technologies, civilian and military. What is a drone? A drone might be a toy for a child, but could also be a weapon of war. And the weapon of war is what it's been used for at the moment. And that's the direction. And then I remember watching a conference with Steve Bannon and some of the great sort of so-called China experts. And they're discussing using, like they say, the Chinese, if they win the artificial intelligence war, they will be able to turn your toaster into a weapon of war against you, because they will be able to make your toaster set your house on fire when you leave your house, right? Or in the night time. And this is the dystopian world these people have entered into. All the psychotic plans that ended in chaos in Europe and Canada over the last month or so, where in Austria, if you were accepting an injection against your will, if you accepted an injection, you could be enticed by visiting a brothel for an hour, and then you would get a free sex with a prostitute, and then you'd get your injection. That was the incentive to get. And if you didn't go and visit the prostitute and get your injection in Austria, you are not allowed to leave your home. And if you left your home, you got a €3,000 fine. And if you refused to pay the fine, they were making special prisons to put these people in prison for a year. And then the Canadians said, if you don't have a vaccine, you can't work, you can't transport goods. And the Canadian truckers mobilised in Ottawa. And suddenly, the things they did against the Russians now, ban payments, steal their money of the oligarchs in Russia, well, they did it against the Canadians themselves.
Yes.
So the war is against the people, by the rulers, against the people. It is not a war of us versus the Russians, or us or the Russians against the Ukrainians, or the Ukrainians against the Russians, or the British against the whoever, Guatemalans. It is a war fought by the rulers to control us. That's the game. And when they talk about going to war and supporting war and attacking Russia or defending Ukraine, it's a lie. They are not interested in the Ukrainians. They're not interested in the Russians. They're interested in control over you. It's power over the people, and only power of the people, like we saw in Canada, like we saw in the protest demonstrations that went on for nearly 2 years, and culminated actually in huge protests in Britain about a month and a half ago, when they protested, the nurses joined in, and suddenly the game was over. As soon as the nurses and the healthcare workers joined the protest demonstration, the game was over. They suddenly announced, they told you about the demo then. They spent 2 years telling you there are no demos, or it's anti-vaxxers, lunatics, conspiracy theorists. And then suddenly the story of, oh, healthcare workers, don't we want to discuss this again? Oh, we don't need the mandate. Oh, we don't need the mandate there. Oh, we don't need to lock you up. Oh, you don't need to wear a mask. Oh, you don't need to distance anymore. Oh, you don't need to wash your hands. Oh, it's not so dangerous. All of a sudden the story changed. One after another, the story was abandoned. And nothing fundamentally has changed from 2 months ago. Nothing. Nothing. There's no less virus around. There's hardly any less sick people. There are still people dying of many other causes as well, by the way. So the idea that something has changed is a lie. And of course, to keep up the anxiousness and fear, we have to talk about World War fucking III. World War III. That's why I sat down the first couple of days of the story and people are sitting in the cafe. You think there's going to be World War III? Fucking hell, are you going to go and fight? Are you going to fight? I don't want to go and fight.
Repent of your sins.
And they put in the news.
Repent of God.
I can't hear you. Take the mask down and we can hear you.
Repent of
Take the
your
mask. You're not
sins.
scared of your spit, love.
Repent of your sins.
What are you
Read
saying?
the
I can't
Bible,
hear you.
obey it, and you go to heaven.
It's worse. Say it from over there without the mask. Go on. Do it. Dare ya. Take it down. No, don't come too close. Oh no! Sanitizer! Oh no, sanitizer! Sanitizer! Jesus loves me, great.
Repent of your sins, precious people. We need to repent.
Is that for when you need
and
2 masks?
God will take control of our lives and change every situation
Well, that's good.
for our good.
Good to know.
He's a good father.
It's good to know that God's
God is
protecting
a
us.
good father.
Because the God that they invented,
Mammon,
Mammon invented a new God, so-called science.
Jesus love you, repent.
Because God was supposed to test us, right? Give us trials, give us tests, check that we behave properly. Now it's government scientists. They come on telly and say, keep a distance from each other. Don't meet with each other. Don't congregate. Go for a test. And if you behave properly, we'll tick you. You've done a very good job, boys. Like in the school, like kindergarten people. That's how they cheated us. For 2 years, we've been cheating like a psychiatric kindergarten. A psychiatric hospital, come prison, come kindergarten. And now we're preparing for war. Well, that's a nice result, isn't it? Don't believe the lies. Mobilise against them in every single way you can. And as Piers Corbyn, who'll be here in a few minutes, says, resist, defy, and do not comply. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Come on.
So what are you saying then? So what are you saying, Paul?
I didn't.
So you said you did.
So, well, he was just calling behind us. Here's it's 5 minutes. He'll be here. That's a few minutes ago, so.
That 5 minutes means 20 minutes.
Well, you know,
So you're saying then basically there's nothing to do with NATO building up near Ukraine and Putin getting pissed off with that?
Well, yeah, there is. There is a lot to do with that. But you know, NATO was never going to do anything. Putin knew they weren't going to do anything.
Why the build-up there then? And the surrounding Russia? Why the build-up of NATO around there?
They did have people in Ukraine fighting the east of Ukraine, and a lot of people died. But ultimately, although that was going on all the time, it wasn't the reason for Russia's action. Russia was a power politics game. You know, we're intervening because we can. And because we can win.
Oh, yeah.
And we know the Yanks won't do anything.
Yeah.
So it's a power game, you know. But they were stupid not to think that. You know. All right, see you guys later, yeah? If Piers comes, we'll record him as well.
Hey, my friend, how are you? Good. My friend, what is your name on YouTube, man?